Hello everyone and welcome to our group's presentation based on the question, how did the Irish Famine refugees who arrived in New York City fare out? We will first place this question into context by examining New York before the Irish immigrants arrived, and then proceed to look at their involvement regarding political, economic and social aspects before concluding with the legacy of Irish immigration. When the famine Irish immigrants poured into New York, the reaction from inhabitants of the city was overwhelmingly negative, holding the common view that the immigrants would have a detrimental effect on New York, stunting the city's progression by increasing poverty levels with the influx of unskilled labourers. However, New York was not untouched by immigration before the famine, as Edward O'Donnell notes that there were beginnings of an Irish community in New York dating from 1798, and due to the structural issues and neglect of the British government in pre-famine Ireland, New York saw immigration from Ireland increase gradually through the 1820s. The pre-famine immigrants also faced a hostile reaction from New York inhabitants, who discriminated against them and often expressed disgust over their living conditions. Whilst on tour of America in 1842, Charles Darwin conveyed his horror at the Irish poor community in New York, criticising the 5 Points area for reeking everywhere with dirt and filth. This intolerance prompted pre-famine immigrants to form an Irish community that was well established by the time famine refugees arrived. The first Irish newspaper appeared in New York in 1810 with the aim to connect Irish immigrants with the news from Ireland and help them settle into a new city. By 1845, this network expanded over a broad range of institutions such as parishes, schools, and societies such as the Emigrant Aid Society, demonstrating how well established the New York Irish community had developed before famine refugees arrived. The community that was created by pre-famine immigrants played a significant part in the life of Irish famine refugees and formed a foundation in which the Irish then mobilised in the political scene of New York.
The arrival of Irish people to New York played a pivotal role in city politics. Due to Irish immigrants already making up a significant portion of the population, thanks to decades of previous emigration, the Irish New York had formed a powerful political bloc in the city that could be hugely influential in local politics. Therefore, in some respects, the New York Irish welcomed the flow of refugees that would increase their political representation in the city. A situation like this emerges because of the political system that had been set up in America. The abolishment of property qualifications for voting in the 1821 Constitution enabled those immigrants who would be made citizens on arrival, a valuable political asset. This was due to a few factors. First of all, the Irish immigrants were white, which qualified them for a vote. Black men, although franchised, were subject to property qualifications. Secondly, the Irish immigrants were extremely tribal, as we will discuss further later on. This meant it was a stable voter base that would often predictably vote the same way. Thirdly, there was a great demand to naturalise the incoming Irish, as to support the Civil War effort. The Irish were technically arriving into a country with more political agency than the one they had left, as Britain would not achieve a similar level of enfranchisement for another half-century. Tammany Hall was the political machine of the Democrat Party. They expertly courted the Irish vote by offering incentives such as the promotion of Irishmen to civil positions. In return, Tammany Hall helped the new waves of Irish with the naturalisation process. Tammany Hall aldermen, most notably Honest John Kelly, were instrumental in championing the rights of Catholics and immigrants in the 1840s, which would certainly have won them the vote of the arriving Irish that would make up nearly a third of the population of New York City by 1855. Opposition to the extraordinary numbers of immigrants came mainly from the Whig Party, who represented the interests of white Protestant Americans who certainly felt their dominance was threatened by the arrival of increasing numbers of Irishmen, and in response formed the Know Nothing Party and new labour organisations to protect the interests of the native population. As Cormac O'Grady notes, no modern anti-immigrant movement in the developed world matches the Know Nothings at their peak in electoral support. Additionally, the incoming Irish also felt the animosity of the largely Protestant Irish that had immigrated in the 16th, 17th and 18th century, and fed into the anti-Catholic and anti-immigration rhetoric of the city that would be a feature of New York politics for the next 30 years. In fact, by the 1870s, leading politicians seriously considered depriving the poor Irish of their vote due to their unparalleled success and influence on city politics.
After discussing the political dimensions of Irish migration into New York, we will proceed to explore the economic dimensions of it. I will talk about it in two different aspects, one from the earlier historiography of Irish migration, and then I will talk about the more recent scholarship on the matter. In 1985, Kirby A. Miller published a book called Emigrants and Exiles, Ireland and the Irish Exodus to North America. He argued that the Irish who arrived in New York, often without capital or skills, were only limited to menial and labour-intensive jobs. They were not well paid, and as recorded by an Irish immigrant from personal experience, a man who labours steadily for 10 to 12 years in America is of very little use afterwards, because he becomes old before his time and generally dies unheeded. This reveals the harshness of work, and also implied the scant income that came with the jobs. The Irish immigrants' living conditions also reflected their economic condition. Archbishop John Hughes said that the abode in the cellars and garrets of New York was as squalid as the places they left behind in Ireland. In fact, the governors of public almshouse reported that between 1849 and 1858, the Irish accounted for 63% of emissions from up to more than 18,000 persons. Edward T. Donnell, writing in 1997, believed that this was a result of their financial inability to improve their living conditions. Miller acknowledged that the Irish migrant community emerged from abject poverty in the first few years of 1850s into a relative stability in the 1870s. But nevertheless, he did not fail to mention that 40% of them still earn their living as unskilled labourers or domestic servants in the 1870s. We can summarise Miller's point that the Irish did not have great economic mobility because of their disadvantage in capital and skills. Poverty kept them in more poverty. What was interesting was Donnell's view on Irish labour. He said that from a purely economic point of view, in the north of America, it was the sweated labour of immigrants, mostly Irish, that made possible the Industrial Revolution. This was an extremely simplified view, as there were obviously many other factors leading to the American Industrial Revolution. However, this does indeed reveal the amount of labour made available with a large influx of Irish immigrants in large cities like New York. These earlier studies of Irish immigrants laid a foundation for further studies into immigration life. Indeed, what they found was true, and I agree with their argument about the relationship between their poverty and their disadvantage as immigrants. However, there was a lot of nuance within this that had not been explored. But luckily for us, technological advancement has enabled historians to approach immigrant history with the help of digital analyses, which revealed the many subtleties in their economic condition. These three authors, while looking at the Emigrant Savings Bank's ledger books, which contained extraordinarily precise detail about the personal particulars of the Irish immigrants, analysed the relationship between the immigrants' networks, their ability to earn, and their ability to save. For example, he found that immigrants were likely to have sought help to find employment from family or friends who have emigrated earlier. For example, a group from three small parishes in Donegal lived right next to each other and were all involved in the same trade, peddling. Another group from Donegal, living in Fourth Ward, was primarily employed in leather production. This showed that Irish immigrants made use of their networks and links to find jobs and usually landed with the same kind of employment as their family and friends. In terms of saving, networks and people's hometown relations played a huge role. Their bank records revealed that immigrants born in Ireland's largest towns saved far less than their rural counterparts. The median peak bank balance achieved by the Irish immigrants who came from towns bigger than 10,000 people was just $100, whereas immigrants from the rest of Ireland saved 61% more. The authors attributed this to the looser kinship ties in urban than in rural Ireland. Or it could have been that they did not find it as difficult to adjust to urban life in New York and thus did not feel the need to ask family or friends for help. Either way, they did not form close networks, and so it hurt their ability to save. This analysis also reveals more about the perceived poverty of Irish immigrants. From the bank records, even peddling, an occupation of last resort in traditional historiography, earned people a good living, and peddlers were able to save a lot. James McShane, who arrived from Killybegs in 1851, found a network of Killybegs peddlers, and in 5 years he had saved $574, an equivalent of 17,000 US dollars today. This was a typical phenomenon in the bank records. Previously, I have stated that rural Irish saved much more than their urban counterparts who emigrated to New York. The rural, poorer Irish people were very likely to be funded by their entire village or family on their voyage across the Atlantic, and it is not surprising at all for them to save up for their family and kinsmen to make their voyage over. Hence, it was not that they had trouble earning money, although that was surely the case for some. However, their perceived poverty was due to their unwillingness to spend their earnings on the material comfort or advancement in society. Because of their strong ties to their homeland, many wanted their family to escape the miserable plight in Ireland and therefore chose to save up instead. In material and observable proxies of wealth, they might be considered poor and economically stagnant, but in real fact they were using their wealth in other channels as revealed by their bank records. Lastly, the relationship between pre-existing capital and skills and their employment after arrival in New York may not be as clear-cut as imagined. The emigrant bank's records indicated that people did significantly improve their economic conditions if they made use of the networks available to them. Often it was the unskilled workers who earned the most money because of their intangible talents. As Ann Binder and O'Grada and Wegg put it, the New York economy rewarded those who took risks, tried new lines of work, and had a talent for entrepreneurship. The unskilled and desperate Irish immigrants possessed these traits and, using them to their advantage, built their life in New York.
There were a variety of social changes caused by Irish immigration, and the most obvious was demographic. As few immigrants had the resources to go further than the coast they landed on, many seeking refuge from the famine settled in New York. Between 1841 and 51, 1.8 million immigrants landed in New York City, 84,000 of which were Irish. Between 1845 and 51, the city was home to 12% of the USA's Irish population, and by 1860, they made up over one-fifth of New York's 800,000 population. In 1880, the city's census estimated that one-third of the population was of Irish heritage. Despite growing numbers, however, life in New York for those from Famine Island could be incredibly difficult for a number of reasons. As their numbers grew across the city, they began searching for work. Through looking at the ESB, Ambinder concluded that the Irish were incredibly efficient savers, but he does note that the Irish found it the most difficult out of any demographic to move up the ladder. Men were generally given work in manual labour thanks to the building boom until 1857, but as Charlie said, these were low-paying jobs and could be seasonal, and social gender norms also meant that women tended to work only until marriage, not unlike in Ireland. Money was often sent home as well. Some unmarried women were able to get jobs in domestic service, which often included boarding, and these could pay much higher than the manual jobs given to men. It also meant that Irish population spread beyond the more poverty-stricken areas of New York, as these domestic jobs would be in more affluent houses, and widowed women sometimes took tenants in as well to earn a living. Despite this, poverty is generally considered to be a defining characteristic of Irish life in New York in the 19th century. For the most part, they inhabited areas of Manhattan, farming animals as they would have at home, and by 1864 it's estimated that 20,000 Irish immigrants were living destitute. Ambinder argues that poverty was more characteristic of the famine immigrants' experience than progress. Over the decades, several fields became more populated by Irish workers, the police force particularly, as well as teaching and family businesses. Letters sent home by Irish immigrants have been said to understate the extent to which there was prosperity in New York. However, when historians have exclusively looked at census statistics, the picture of Irish life in New York becomes far drearier, detailing social isolation, economic problems and persecution. Kirby Miller, who Ambinder calls today's most influential historian of 19th century Irish immigration, states that in general, the famine Irish experience in the New World was one of poverty and hardship. They faced the highest rates of disease such as typhus, typhoid and cholera, and endured significant anti-Irish sentiment from non-Irish people. As it had been back home in Ireland, religion played a massive role in the settling of Irish immigrants in New York. Generally, the Irish were somewhat tribal in how they lived, choosing to live amongst other Irish people, and even as they became a more affluent group towards the end of the century, they did continue to stick together. As a result, though, the anti-Irish and anti-Catholic attitudes in New York were strengthened, resulting in clashes between Irish communities and others. In the 1850s, a reverend called Daniel Parsons preached to a crowd of over 10,000 about the dangers of Irish immigration, and a group called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner frequently went into Irish neighbourhoods to provoke the residents and pick fights. The Orange Riot of 1871 saw conflicts between Irish Catholics and Protestants in New York, and conflicts like these only increased the dissatisfaction with Irish immigration. Regardless of this, however, Irish communities became very involved in local politics, never being passive workers. They frequently became involved in trade unions, striking at various points over the 50s and 60s. Similarly, there was a big Irish participation in the Democratic Party, which often split into factions, so the Irish took advantage and encouraged pro-Irish sentiment. Irish nationalism also followed them to New York. There was a great deal of effort by factionalist groups to support the cause back home for Irish independence. Diana argues that while those already in New York saw the Irish as an undifferentiated mass, they were actually a deeply divided group, full of varying political and nationalist opinions. Despite poverty being rife, they were generally incredibly active in supporting one another, forming charitable organisations in their local neighbourhoods to support the poorest Irish, and religion played into this hugely, and many of those who were destitute relied on the Catholic Church in New York for survival. The Church therefore transformed into an organisation that functioned to support the poor. Those organisations made it easier for future immigrants, and although they didn't entirely alleviate the burden of poverty, they did, as Diana suggests, bridge the chasm between being immigrants from Ireland to being Irish Americans. Similarly, she argues that the political machine, the machine of urban government, the Roman Catholic Church, the social and cultural organisations of the community, and the nationalist movements, they all helped define Irish ethnicity and a New York urban life that transcended the pathos of poverty. Ultimately, although life as an Irish immigrant in New York City had its significant difficulties, elements of life from home, such as tight-knit communities and religious connections, allowed for some comfort in an incredibly unfamiliar place.
1964. However, it is crucial to remember that the famine refugees did not come to New York to live the American dream, but to escape starvation, and the life they made in New York was a vast improvement from the struggle in Ireland. This opportunistic quality amongst the Irish has been demonstrated by my fellow group members, in which the Irish immigrants took advantage of the resources New York offered and made the most of their situation. Over time, attitudes regarding Irish immigration also improved due to their fixed position in society and involvement in the large numbers of sectors throughout New York. Tyler Ambinder provides an example of Tim Sullivan, who arrived in New York as a young immigrant delivering newspapers and grew up to become Big Tim Sullivan, the political ruler of downtown New York, demonstrating the involvement of Irish immigrants in society. By 1870, New York had the largest Irish community in America and stood at the centre of Irish American political, cultural and social activism. Irish influence is still prominent in New York today. For example, the food and drink sector have Irish pubs selling Guinness and restaurants cooking soda bread and Irish stew. In addition to this, almost half of the US presidents have some Irish descent, such as John F. Kennedy and Barack Obama, which is an impressive consequence of the Irish immigration. Considering the upcoming season, the Irish community in New York is even represented in songs, such as the fan favourite Christmas song Fairy Tale of New York, which is based on J.P. Donleavy's 1973 novel about a bereaved Irish American's return home from New York to Manhattan. The broad span of Irish influence across all sectors of America, such as politics and culture, demonstrates that the legacy of Irish immigration to New York did not just create poverty and discrimination, but in fact enriched a community that contributed greatly to New York. The immigration of Irish famine refugees to New York initiated a considerable anti-Irish and anti-Catholic reaction amongst the city's inhabitants, with most Irish refugees continuing to live in poverty. However, after taking the political, economic and social aspects into consideration, the Irish famine refugees utilised the assets of New York and did experience an improvement in political and economic sectors. Through the immigrants' active participation in American society, they generated great influence in the political scene and built up their savings accounts as a protective measure against their past trauma with the famine. Although they faced a hostile reaction from the people in New York, with even the construction of anti-immigration movements such as the Know Nothing Party, this was eased due to the existing Irish community and religious connections. The legacy of Irish immigration encapsulates how the Irish famine refugees controlled their own fate in New York and became an integral part of the city.